Appreciate the invitation to come and have part in this program. Always a pleasure to be back with the great Bellview congregation. Appreciate the elders here, Brother Michael Hatcher, so very much, and the fine work they continue to do. We heard a tremendous lesson just an hour ago from Brother Tracy Duggar on the existence of God. The Hebrews writer declares in Hebrews 11:6 that without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he that cometh unto God must believe that He is, but that's not enough. That He is also, is that on or off? I thought it was on. Away from power. Well, I pushed it all the way from. All right. Okay. Must believe that He is, and is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. We must come to a knowledge and understanding and belief in the nature of God, the essential attributes of God, those things that must be the case in order for God to be the being who He is. The Bible affirms the superiority of the great I Am. And it is vital that we have faith in God and that this faith be founded upon adequate evidence. The Bible, confirmed by internal and external evidences to be the very Word of God, provides a sufficient record of God's dealings with men in order to establish the proper ground of credibility for faith in Him. In fact, that's what the biblical record's about, is to provide that ground of credibility. He is the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent sovereign of the universe. Given the essential attributes of deity, God cannot help but be the being that He is. He must therefore be absolute in all of His attributes, and to fail to be absolute in any one of His attributes would imply that He could not be God, which would be self-contradictory. So the fact of God's existence is important, but not only the fact, the nature of God is important, His essence and a proper belief in the divine essence, and that includes His superiority. We must understand that the issue of the existence of God and the nature of God, from these follow everything else. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher existentialist, said that if there is no God, anything goes. Anything follows. You can practice anything, do anything. There is no right or wrong. Everything is just morally neutral. And so the existence of God and the nature of God, which follows from the propositions the Bible has to say or presents concerning the nature of God relative to His existence, are things of paramount importance. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, we have our text. And the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod. When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up by Dagon. And when they of Ashdod arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon and set him in his place again. And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. Therefore neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. That's reading down through verse 5. The background of this text is set in the tremendous and horrific defeat of Israel at Aphek. There was an initial battle that took place at Aphek in which 4,000 men of Israel were slain. And the Israelites, particularly the elders among the people, got together and they discussed their defeat, and rather than putting it down to what the real reason was, the fact that they had turned their back on God, the fact that they were following ungodly leaders, particularly Hophni and Phinehas, the rebellious sons of Eli, instead of putting the emphasis on the problems and correcting the problems and then going back to battle, they instead thought, well, we'll bring out the Ark of the Covenant. And that will just wow these Philistines. We'll just stampede them into defeat. Surely if we have the Ark in our presence, God will fight for us. Years later, the Israelites in the days of Jeremiah would have similar thoughts as they faced the armies of Babylon. You will recall that Jeremiah said the people were going about saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. God won't destroy this city because the temple's here. And in fact, He'll keep the Babylonians from destroying us. That same thought was prevalent among these people relative to the Ark of God. They willfully chose to ignore their own transgressions. And as a result, they resorted to this unprecedented use of the ark to strike fear in the hearts of their enemies, and perhaps thought that this would compel God to fight on their behalf. Now Samuel had earlier prophesied of the destruction of the house of Eli, 1 Samuel 3, verses 10 through 14, and the defeat of Israel had been by God's design. And would be by God's design. You know the rest of the record there, and how they gathered up their forces and they went against the Philistines again at Aphek. And the ark, of course, was taken. Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the city of Shiloh itself ultimately was sacked and destroyed. 30,000 footmen perished on that day. When news of the defeat reached the aged Eli concerning his rebellious sons, and whom he had not tried to restrain, he heard the news and fell over backwards, and he being of great age, he broke his neck and died. And news also came in to his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, just as she was about to give birth to a son. And she died in the process of delivering that child, whom just before passing away, she said, she called him Ichabod, meaning no glory, for the glory of Israel, or the glory of God's departed from Israel. And so she died. What a terrible day in the history of this nation. What an awful condition of things they had been brought to by virtue of the ungodliness of their own leadership, and by the misuse of the Ark of the Covenant. Just think about the Ark for a second relative to that aspect of it. The Ark was the most precious piece of furniture in all of ancient Israel. The Ark of the Covenant was the very heart and focal point of the Jewish faith. The tabernacle was important. The tabernacle had been built at the behest of God. He had commanded Moses to build a tabernacle that I may dwell among them, Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. And Moses had built the tabernacle and had made it according to all that God commanded. And he did so according to the pattern which was shown unto him in the mountain, that is Mount Sinai. And in the tabernacle, in the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, he placed there the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was basically a box overlaid with pure gold. But as I said, it was a very holy and very sacred piece of furniture, and of great importance to the Jewish nation. on the lid of this box was the mercy seat. And it was between the two cherubim that were placed upon this mercy seat with their wings outstretched and their heads bowed down toward the center of that seat that God would appear to commune with Moses. And he would make his presence, what the rabbis referred to as the Shekinah glory, would be made manifest in the tabernacle from that place. And it was upon the mercy seat that every year the high priest would sprinkle the blood of the atonement in anticipation ultimately of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who is our mercy seat, our propitiation. 1 John chapter 2, 1 and 2. And year after year the high priest was to go in and make atonement for his sins and then for the sins of the people. And assuming that they would do that faithfully and every year, that there would be no year that would be missed, then this would proceed for over some 1,500 years down to the crucifixion of Christ in anticipation of that death. And so this was a very special piece of furniture to the mind of any Hebrew, or it should have been to any Hebrew that had any inkling or any concept of the significance of atonement. Also in the mercy seat, or beneath the mercy seat, beneath the lid, inside the Ark of the Covenant itself, were placed the tables of stone. There was the Pentateuch that Moses himself had written. There was also placed there Aaron's rod that budded and a pot of manna. And all of these had significance to the Hebrews and importance in God's plan as far as their typological purpose in pointing to the better way of the New Testament. The rod emphasized the importance of leadership. The tables of stone, the law itself, emphasized the importance of divine government. Manna reminded them of God's provision and of the great providence of God in caring for them. And we need to understand or view this through their eyes as they would look upon these things, or as they should have been looking upon these things, that we understand the depth of the despair that the nation felt, or should have felt, when this piece of furniture fell into the hands of the Philistines. Imagine what went through the minds of people in Oklahoma City when the building there blew up. The devastation. You pass that building every day, and it was nothing really special, but you do know that there are people, human beings in there. And it is a government building. And it is representative of America. Imagine the thinking of New Yorkers as the World Trade Center was bombed. Now let's take it one step further. Suppose someone made an act of terrorism against the Lincoln Memorial or the White House itself. What kind of horror, what kind of anger, what kind of emotions would run rampant through the hearts of American people as they viewed these things? This especially would be true of the Hebrews concerning the Ark of the Covenant, if they had any idea of the ultimate significance of that ark, any inkling of it. The dark day had come to Israel, but in the midst of this darkness, the radiance of God's superiority would shine through and lead ultimately and clearly to a greater victory by Samuel on that very same field of battle in 1 Samuel chapter 7. It has been said that light appears brighter in the midst of darkness, and that it catches the eye more readily in such gloom. Defeat often leads to victory. You think about some of the great events of world history. times when it seemed like civilization itself was ready to blink out of existence and barbarism was going to run wild. In our own age, many of you can recall the events surrounding the defeat of the British and the French in the German Blitzkrieg, and the escape the British barely made at Dunkirk. But Dunkirk ultimately led to D-Day. We had Pearl Harbor for our own country. But ultimately there came Hiroshima and Nagasaki and surrender of Japan. Events that were so dark and gloomy that led people almost to the point of despair. What will we do if the Nazis or the Japanese or the Italian fascists should gain control? Ultimately gave way to celebration in the streets of our cities and of much of Europe and Asia. As a result, since that time, the world in general has been at peace. Well, we've had problems with the communists, and we've had border wars and skirmishes and strife, but world war itself has not had to be fought again. Defeat often leads to victory. Such was true of the early Christians. Go back and examine the history of the early church and the awful persecutions. Especially I'm mindful of those of the 3 Ds, the emperors, Domitian, Decius, and Diocletian. The tremendous devastation that they wrought against the church. The thousands upon thousands they put to death. And yet, at the very height of the worst persecution, that of Diocletian in 305, suddenly persecution ends, and a man by the name of Constantine comes to the front and declares that Christianity is no longer an illegal religion. And instead of being persecuted, it prospers and triumphs. In the dark despair. When I first started preaching, I remember reading concerning textual criticism of the New Testament that there were roughly 4,000 to 7,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. 4,000 to 7,000 manuscripts, depending on which sources you noted. Now I read sources that are citing upward of 40,000 to 50,000 in 25 years' time. It's estimated that at the current rate of discovery and the cataloging of such manuscripts, that we may very well by the end of this decade have as many as 60,000 to 70,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. And what has been shown in the process of all of this? That we have the Bible that the apostles used, in essence. That every truth, every doctrinal truth is there. That no doctrine is in question, and there is not a problem that cannot be answered, that cannot be dealt with. 60,000 to 70,000. As opposed to 4,000 or 7,000 25 years ago. There is more reason now to believe in God. There is more reason now to believe in the integrity of the New Testament and the integrity of the Bible in general. More reason now to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as it were, than ever before. The evidence just continues to pile up. And yet, we live in a time of darkness and a time of evil and a time in which it seems on every hand Satan seems to triumph. Yet the evidence continues to mount in favor of the Christian faith. It's always been that way. You think about concerning the manuscripts again. Decius, Domitian, Diocletian, all those and others, Julian the Apostate, had copies of the manuscripts rounded up and burned, destroyed. People that had them in their possessions were put to death or thrown in prison. And despite the thousands of manuscripts that they without doubt destroyed, we have more manuscripts of the Greek New Testament than we have of the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 major ancient documents combined. More. In the 25 intervening years since I began preaching, how many manuscripts have we found of Aristotle's work? Goose egg. Does anyone question whether or not Aristotle wrote his essay on man in the universe? I don't know of a historian that does. Yet we have far more evidence underlying and undergirding the integrity of the New Testament text. We need to understand that oftentimes what seems to be defeat, darkness, persecution leads to victory and vindication. One of my favorite stories from church history concerns a young lady by the name of Blandina of Lyon, and how she was hoisted up above the arena and in a chair of iron. She was tied, bound, and her family was brought into the arena beneath her. And the governor called upon her to denounce Christ, and he let her family live. And she refused. And one by one he put to death each member of her family, stopping long enough to again ask her, "Will you renounce Christ?" She refused. Another one died. Another one died. Finally, they lowered her into the arena and unloosed the lions to tear her apart. Death, but victory. Death, but triumph. The devil glories, the devil enjoys and rejoices in his triumphs. But they are fleeting in comparison to the great victories of eternity. Ashdod, without doubt, celebrated the tremendous victory that they had won in the two battles at Aphek, and especially the second that had led to the destruction of Shiloh itself. Oh, how the Philistines must have hooted and howled and carried on. All of the ungodly actions that were associated and are associated with pagan religion. We think that evil was invented by American hedonists. American hedonists are just walking in the same old paths the old pagans carved out long ago. Homosexuality, bestiality, every form of ality that you could possibly come up with was practiced by these people. And they engaged in what were without doubt the fertility rites associated with the worship of Dagon. I discussed that somewhat in the text, the manuscript. And they engaged in these ungodly things. And they brought in the Ark of God and they put it in the temple of Dagon, and they did it for basically two reasons. One, as a gratitude offering, as Adam Clark notes. And also, as he observes, for the sake of proving, quote unquote, to themselves and to their neighbors that their gods were stronger than the God of Israel. This was common thinking among heathen people. If we beat you, then we beat your God, or our God beat your God. And they failed to realize or reckon with the fact that there is a God beyond all gods, the God who is the true and living God, in whom we live and move and have our being, who can use one nation to punish another nation for the sake of chastisement, cleansing, and things of this nature in His good providence. At any event, while they're celebrating, God is acting. And the result leads to Dagon's demise. On the first morning after the victory celebration, some of the Philistines came into the temple of Dagon, perhaps to perform some of the appropriate sacrifices and maybe to give a thank offering to him for the victory of the preceding days. But they found his image lying prostrate on the floor before the ark of the Lord, appearing as it were, as though the image of a pagan god was now bowing in reverence before the symbol of the true and living God, the ruler of heaven and earth. Adam Clarke has this statement. He states, quote, "This was one proof which they little expected of the superiority of the God of Israel," unquote. The Philistines dutifully set their lifeless idol up into its place once again. They raised it up, the King James says. S.R. Driver, in his notes on the book of Samuel, states that this Hebrew term is very expressive and emphasizes this idea of duty that they were doing, that they were acting. The idol couldn't act itself. It couldn't move. They had to do it. They were the ones who had to raise it up. You know what's fascinating about idolatry, and idolatry of any form, whether it's self-worship in humanism or idol worship, is that really that which we worship has no power in comparison to the power of Him who made us. When we were in Taiwan doing mission work, there were 2 days out of the year in which the various temples, and there were roughly about 200 temples in the little county in which we lived called Taidong, on the southeastern corner of Taiwan. And they would place their idols, they'd bring the idols out and they'd put them on divans or set them in a sedan chair. And they would place the divan or the sedan chairs upon the shoulders of some of their adherents, worshippers. And they would parade these idols up and down the streets. They would go north to south one night and east to west the next night. And they would move them from place to place and take them from one business to the next and from one house to the next. And the people, the inhabitants there, would lay out their offerings. They would have bowls of fruit for the idols to eat. Of course, they ate very little. They would have incense for them to sniff, but again, they would sniff very little. And they would even burn money to them. You know, the interesting thing is the government caught on to the money-making aspect of this. I understand when, for many years, the Chinese had been burning real money. The government said, we can't have this. This is legal tender going up in smoke. And so they began printing temple money. And you could go and buy the temple money with a legal tender. And so the government would get the legal tender and it'd go to the government. But they'd give this temple money, which was virtually worthless. You couldn't buy a thing with it, but they'd burn it to their ancestors and to their false gods and goddesses. In any event, government ripped the people off, out using their own superstition against them. The government's done that many times. We have it in this country. It's called the lottery. Somebody said, you know what the lottery is? The economist in the University of South Florida says it's a tax, secret tax. He was asked, what do you mean it's a tax? He said, it's a tax on fools. In any event, they go. You know what all of that proved? All of the rigmarole, all of hootenanny that goes on in association with this, that those idols could not do one single solitary thing by themselves. They could not move, they could not talk, they could not eat, they could not smell, they could not hear, they could not help, they could not intervene on behalf of these people. They had no power. That's what it proved. And the priests and the priestesses would go tinkling and jumping and hopping about and hollering and carrying on behind the idols. And some of them would carry their lancets just like the prophets of Baal. And they would cut their bodies and whack their legs and hit their arms. Or they would use a mace, a big old iron mace attached to a rod and by way of a piece of chain, and they would hit themselves and bruise their bodies and cut themselves open. And they'd say, "Our gods are protecting us." What they didn't tell you was they'd do this after they had chewed the betel nut, which had a tendency to numb the pain, or they had taken prescription medicine to do the same. And then they didn't tell you that 2 days later they'd be at the hospital trying to get the doctor to stitch them up before they bled to death, or to give them painkillers. They didn't want you to know about that. And all of that proved was that idolatry is foolish. Absolutely foolish. And the pressing need, it reminded us of the pressing need of the gospel. You know, I read the statement in Acts 17 how Paul saw that the city was given wholly to idolatry. It was stirred within him, his spirit stirred within him. And I can understand that, having stood there in Taiwan and seen some of that type of nonsense go on. You know, American people are not much smarter. We have people right now standing in buildings in various parts of this country with their hands raised, screaming and hollering to Jehovah God and acting in such a fashion that's contrary to His will, and He's not listening to them. And He's not going to listen to that kind of foolishness. And some of our brethren have joined into it. Call it praise worship. And so on. And so Dagon's put up. They sent him back into his place. The second day, however, told a different story. They came back in. God decided to end this contest with one stroke. You want to put Dagon back in his place, let's say you put him back together. They came in, and to the horror of the adherents of the religion of Dagon, they saw that the false god not only was once more fallen upon his face, but his head and his hands were severed from the torso, so that only the stump was left. The severed parts were lying on the threshold of the sanctuary, and I believe, based on what I've been able to gather from the text, that the head and hands were shattered to the point that there was no way to put him back together again. Humpty Dumpty was broken. And all the king's horses and all the king's men were not going to put him back together again. And what a stunning demonstration of Jehovah God's power, superiority over Dagon. God has demonstrated over and over again His superiority over everything that exalts itself and vaunts itself against Him. He demonstrated it when He created the heavens and earth and spoke it into existence ex nihilo. Genesis 1, verse 1. He demonstrated it when He destroyed the world with water. He demonstrated it when He turned the cities of the plain to ash, almost in one stroke. He demonstrated it when He sent an angel among the host of the Assyrians and left 185,000 of them dead in their sleep. He demonstrated it when He raised His only begotten Son from the dead. And there will be a final and ultimate demonstration when every man, woman, accountable being will stand before Almighty God and give an account for everything done in our bodies according to that which we have done. Thank you.